An unprecedented assault on freedom of expression. That's how Al Jazeera is describing an Egyptian court's death sentence against 6 people, including 2 of its own journalists. So what impact will this have on journalism in Egypt and press freedoms? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. A court in Egypt has sentenced 6 people to death for allegedly leaking state secrets to Qatar. Amongst them are 2 Al Jazeera journalists who were sentenced in absentia. Asmaa Mohamed, al-Khatib, identified as a reporter with a pro-Muslim Brotherhood news outlet, was also sentenced to death in absentia. Al Jazeera categorically denies allegations it was collaborating with former President Mohamed Morsi's elected government. The case against Morsi, who is also facing charges of spying for Qatar, has been adjourned. But he's already been sentenced to death and life in prison in 3 separate trials. Saturday's sentence will now be examined by Egypt's Grand Mufti, the country's highest legal authority. Well, Al Jazeera's former director of news, Ibrahim Helal, is one of the journalists sentenced to death. He says the verdict was politically motivated.
As a person who is sentenced to death in absentia, I don't have any right to appeal. I don't have any right to be represented legally. I know that since day one of this case has started more than one year and a half ago. It's full of inconsistency. The main inconsistency is that we, as one of the 3 journalists, we are accused of collaborating between Muslim Brotherhood as a group and the government of Qatar. This is a very big inconsistency because the media regime, the media tycoons in Egypt are making this propaganda every day that Qatar is a big supporter of Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't make any sense that Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar needed me to mediate between them. This is a very big inconsistency. Another inconsistency is how come you are sentencing those who are helping in publishing information more than those who leaked the information. It doesn't make sense at all that those who were working in the previous president's office were not sentenced as tough as we, a journalist, sentenced to death today just because we participated in publishing a few lines in one document.
Well, Al Jazeera is calling for international efforts to protect journalists. It's released a statement saying the ruling is unprecedented in the history of journalism in the world. It represents a stab in the back of the profession and freedom of expression worldwide. It goes on to say global news organisations and the international community should not stand silent in the face of the intimidation of free expression. Well, let's discuss this further. Let's bring in our guests. Here in Doha, we have Abdel Fayed. He is editor of Egyptian Affairs and former CAIRO bureau chief for Al Jazeera. In London, international lawyer Saad Jabbar. And in Birmingham, Alabama, Mohamed Morsi, an Egyptian political analyst and professor of communications at the University of North Alabama. Thank you all very much for joining us here on Inside Story today. Mohamed, if I could start with you, as someone who's outside of Al Jazeera, what do you make of this latest case? I mean, what evidence have we seen being presented to support the allegations that these journalists collaborated with the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, it's difficult to talk about evidence simply because the Egyptian judiciary has a notoriously bizarre history of dealing with evidence. You remember a year and a half ago, the evidence that was presented against other Al Jazeera employees, Peter Gresta, Mohammed Fahmy, and Bahir Mohammed, included, for example, a European family vacation and a news report about Somalia. Earlier this year, the judiciary handed down a life sentence to a 3-year-old toddler. In 2014, they handed down a mass death sentence against 529 people over the alleged killing of a single police officer. In that trial, the defense wasn't even allowed to present evidence or counter evidence, and the trial only lasted an hour and a half. So if ever the phrase kangaroo court was appropriate, I think it would be appropriate right now in the case of Egypt. I don't think any of these allegations are to be taken seriously. This is clearly part of Egypt's larger war, which is a war against all forms of political dissent and opposition. Caught in the crosshairs are obviously political parties who have been banned and imprisoned en masse, but also activists, journalists, academics, human rights workers. So this is a pretty comprehensive program. It's been ongoing for the better part of 3 years, and we've seen unprecedented repression in Egypt. And this case has to be viewed within that larger context.
If we can just hone in a little bit, just for a moment, on this particular case, Abdel Fattah, how did you see it being presented against not only the Al Jazeera journalists, but the other defendants in that courtroom yesterday?
Yes, there is Mohamed Morsi, the former president, and there is another 10. The total defendants is 11, including the Mohamed Morsi, and there is 3 sentences to death, 3 of them in prison, and the 3 others is in absentia. The 3 in absentia, as we know, the 3 journalists, Asmaa al-Khatib, Ibrahim Helal, and Alaa Sablan. And there is another 3 inside the jail already. Ahmed Afifi, he is also related to the media field. He's working as the producer of a documentary films. And so if you have a look on the defendants, you will find all of them is the former president, the isolated president, and his consultants and his advisors. Dr. Ahmed Abdel, he was his director of his bureau, and Ayman al-Sarafi, one of his counselors. And you will find all of them even from the presidential organization or journalists, especially Al Jazeera. When you find the verdict, you will find that the main defendants, didn't face death, but the journalist is facing the death. And this is, as you know, according to former judges, this is a big mistake in the verdict from the professional side, only from the professional side. Well,
let's bring in a lawyer on that point. I mean, it's an interesting point that Abdel Fattah raises, that of everybody there, it was the journalists who received the harshest sentence, the death penalty. Why would that be?
Well, the fundamental rule here is that you cannot have an independent judiciary in any military regime. No dictatorial regime in modern or ancient history has ever allowed an independent judiciary and independent judges to exist. However, there is a big difference now in Egypt, because blatantly those judges are just doing what the big boss, the Pinochet of Egypt, is telling them to do. And therefore, to talk about the rule of law and link it to the Sisi regime, you must be living in a utopia which has never existed, and it will never exist.
Okay, so
and when I mentioned
sorry, if we could then cut out the middleman, as you're referring perhaps to the legal system as, and we just go straight to Sisi, why would Sisi want to give the death penalty to journalists? I mean, it's pretty unusual, isn't it, for a journalist to receive a death penalty sentence?
Remember, only recently, many judges were sacked from the judiciary. So terror has been transferred everywhere, touching every sector in Egypt, from the press to the judiciary to the political parties. So no section or sector in the Egyptian life has not been prejudiced and tarnished and polluted by this dictator. This dictator is the most dangerous one in modern history, of the Middle East. That's why I'm surprised that the biggest democracy on earth is appeasing this man, forgetting that many dictators who came and the West supported them, and they wanted the so-called maintaining security at the expense of democracy, and they achieved neither. We saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Libya, and I mean, the double standards we are seeing now, where congressmen were very, very tough on dictatorial regimes, they have made an exception vis-a-vis the Egyptian regime. When you look at the foreign the State Department human rights report, it's damning of the Egyptian regime, yet the Secretary of State Kerry made a waiver vis-a-vis Egypt in terms of aid and stepping up support for the regime. What would the Egyptians and Arabs feel when they see that the only party which is protected is Israel because of the Egyptian regime is maintaining that peace or the so-called peace process with Israel. Therefore, basic human rights of the Egyptians doesn't matter.
Yeah, we'll be looking at the international reaction a little later in this discussion. I just want to stick with the legal system that we're looking at for the moment, because Saad, you've represented Ahmed Mansour, haven't you? He's another senior Al Jazeera journalist. Viewers may remember he was briefly detained in Germany last year. He was also sentenced in absentia. He was sentenced to 15 years. So what was your experience representing him?
Look, the Egyptian regime, when they failed to convince the Interpol to arrest the Al Jazeera journalists, the Egyptian regime resort to another trick, contacting governments bilaterally and trying to convince them that someone, was sought by the Egyptian justice. Ahmed Mansour, when he went back to Turkey after his arrest in Germany, when it transpired and became clear that the Interpol did not want to consider the Egyptian request, the Egyptians went to Turkey as well, and Mohamed Morsi was stopped at the airport another time until there was an intervention by the highest levels in the Turkish government. And I'm sure the regime will use the same trick. They will use that against Ibrahim Helal and others to say, look, these people are sought by the so-called Egyptian justice. Therefore, they will harass these journalists and they will prevent them from doing their job properly because they need to travel at short notice. They don't want to be hindered. And the regime will enjoy sadistically to see any of the Al Jazeera journalists arrested at airports, and it will take few days, weeks sometimes for any authority or any country to know the truth and then release them. So there is a tactic, there is that repression, and the regime is exporting its repression extraterritorially from Egypt to abroad. And unfortunately, Western democracies have not taken their responsibilities seriously towards protecting journalists, although there is a Security Council resolution which was passed a few years ago stipulating that any attack on journalists or their equipment, even in areas of crisis or war, should be considered as war crime or crime against humanity. Where is the biggest advocate of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, which is called the United States?
That resolution, we did look at that earlier. I mean, that resolution specifically looks at areas of armed conflict, so perhaps it could be argued that that doesn't apply to Egypt.
No, it does. If you require warring factions dealing with the most difficult times when they are fighting, killing each other, to require them to protect the life, respect journalists, and any crime against them will be considered as war crime or crime against humanity. Let alone when you have someone called Sisi, the general, is supported, sponsored, financed by the United States,
Abdel,
militarily and economically.
Let's just bring you into the discussion at this point again, because you've had 3 cases as well brought against you by the Egyptian government. What did they entail?
Yeah, there is, many cases against. There is a lot of journalists actually facing, charges in Egypt. So I'm facing, a case calling for dropping nationality, and we don't know why. They are saying that he have nationality of Qatar. I don't have any other passport except the Egyptian passport, and they know that. But this is some pressure practicing on the journalist just to stop talking or to stop giving any other opinions. And this is the same, the same target of the verdict of yesterday. It's a message not only to Ibrahim Helal or to just specified journalists, it's for all of us, especially who are still talking and giving quotes on the screens. And for all Egyptian journalists, actually, you can connect between this verdict and what is happening in the press syndicate in Egypt. Of course, it's very important. All the Egyptian, there is, Laura, there is more than 70 Egyptian journalists behind the bars right now. We are talking about, there is another one who have sentenced to death also. Nobody talking about him. He called Walid Abdel Shalabi. He's an Egyptian journalist, and he's a member of the press syndicate. I'm a member of the press syndicate. I'm not just, you know, a television journalist. I worked for a printed media. I am a member of the press syndicate since 18th of last century till now, and although of that, the press syndicate cannot defend its members. You know, after the security forces, you know, go inside the. Yeah.
I want to get onto
Yes.
Egyptian, the press syndicate. It's a really interesting issue. Just after, we just look a little bit more at the Al Jazeera situation and how it's being targeted, and then we will return to local journalists, because since Egypt's military coup almost 3 years ago, dozens of journalists have been arrested and several television stations shut down, as we've been hearing. But the crackdown does seem to have been particularly targeted at Al Jazeera's operations. On July 3rd, Egyptian authorities raided Al Jazeera Arabic and Mubasher bureaus in Cairo. 28 staff were arrested and released later. On July 15th, Al Jazeera's Mubasher's cameraman, Mohamed Badr, was arrested. On August 14th, Al Jazeera journalist Abdullah al-Shami was detained. He was released in June 14 on medical grounds. He had been on hunger strike for more than 130 days. On August the 27th, Al Jazeera correspondent Wayne Hay, cameraman Adil Bradlow and producer Russ Finn were detained. They were released 5 days later. And on December 29th, Peter Gresham, Baha Mohamed and Mohamed Fahmy were arrested. And later they were sentenced to prison terms. They were charged with helping the Muslim Brotherhood after a legal battle that lasted more than a year. They were freed and finally pardoned in September last year. Mohamed, why do you think we are seeing, certainly the story is about all journalists, but let's just focus a second on why we're seeing Al Jazeera particularly being targeted?
Well, because Al Jazeera was one of the prominent international news networks that correctly, frankly, labeled the events of summer 2013 a military coup. You know, it's important to note that the New York Times, The Guardian, The Independent, CNN, they've also been sort of blacklisted in Egypt. They're also talked about as being supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I think Al Jazeera is especially relevant to the Egyptian authorities because they do Arabic language broadcasting, obviously, and they're more influential inside of Egypt and in the region. So I think that's one of the main reasons why Al Jazeera in particular has drawn the ire of the Egyptian government.
Okay, well, let's just take a look at the World Press Freedom Index and where Egypt ranks in that, because out of 180 countries, we've got Finland out on top, and it's taken the first position for the past 5 years. But Egypt is much closer to the bottom of the list, coming in at 159, just below Iraq. Reporters Without Borders says there is a ceasification of the media, and the government is using it to carry out a witch hunt against the banned Muslim Brotherhood. Abdel Fattah, I'm sorry I interrupted you there because you were talking about the journalist syndicate in Egypt and how it's recently been targeted. I mean, what is it like in this current climate to work as a local journalist in Egypt?
Yeah, this actually clarified that it's an attack against freedom of speech, freedom of journalism. It just targeting actually Al Jazeera only. Although the Al Jazeera is a leading station, and it's a international and worldwide, you know, have a worldwide influence, but in Egypt right now, it's forbidden to have any other, and this is any other opinion or even any other information. You know, there is a law in Egypt which is calling terrorism law, forbidden to publish or to broadcast any information which does not come from the government. And anyone who will publish it, he considered as a terrorist. You know, and he punished as a terrorist. This already, this comes, you know, and the press syndicate, you know, was refusing this law, but it didn't have any ability to change it. So it's an attack against the freedom of speech. The Egyptian journalism right now cannot defend its members. You know, two of the members are already arrested from the building of the press syndicate, and they are part of the authority. They are, you know, they are enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are not allies of the Muslim Brotherhood or Mohamed Morsi. They are supporting al-Sisi and supporting the regime, although of that because they are just called for some protesters, they arrested, and now the council of the press syndicate, you know, have a pressure to delay the General Assembly, which was planned for next Tuesday because the political pressure.
So has Sisi gone a step too far there?
Yeah, of course, of course.
So what's going to be the backlash, though?
You know, if you continue practice this pressure for everybody, even the opposition or the allies, of course, this will lead the country to the worst. Not only the journalist community, but for sure right now it's targeting everybody. As I told you, more than 200 journalists arrested in Egypt, some of them for 1 year or some months or some weeks. But up till now there is over 70 behind the bars. Some of them sentences with harm.
Saad Jabari, what do you make of journalists being able to be tried under this anti-terrorism law that was only introduced in 2015? It's a very new idea for Egypt.
Well, this is the problem. I mean, any dictatorial regime would understand that freedom of expression, freedom of the press is one of the main freedoms or most important freedoms, although freedoms are indivisible in terms of democracy and reform building in any country. So the United States Constitution and others, the first or the most modern democracies in the world, stress that right as one of the cornerstones in building up any democracy or starting any meaningful and serious reforms in order to create a modern state. That's why Sisi and those who appease him, they don't understand that they are really supporting someone who's a threat to Egypt itself. All these measures he's taking, no other president in modern history in Egypt has ever engaged in such hostile acts against, from the judiciary to the press to no president in modern history did that yet.
Mohamed, we've touched quite a lot on this lack of international pressure on Sisi. Why do you think we're hearing so little from the world community?
Well, I think in part because a lot of Western powers think that it's much safer to have an autocrat ruling Egypt. This is, you know, stability is kind of the word of the day, and if you dig deep into the statements made by the Obama administration, for instance, you can read into their statements that they would prefer kind of a stabilizing force. And from their perspective, who better to stabilize Egypt than the Egyptian military? In my estimation, and the estimation of many political scientists, that's a misguided view and a misguided approach, partly because in taking that approach, one is forced to abandon basic principles of democracy and human rights and freedom, but also because, you know, autocracy doesn't necessarily lead to stability. And what we've seen in Egypt, frankly, is unprecedented instability. Repression has led directly to an increase in terrorism. Previously, dormant ISIS offshoots have gained power. And Egypt has become something of a recruiting hotbed for ISIS. So we're hearing more and more calls from Western voices and sources suggesting that the approach taken by the Obama administration and also other Western powers is wrong, it's misguided, and that it needs to change. But
Abdel,
I'm not necessarily optimistic that that's going to happen anytime soon.
We've got literally 30 seconds left. This case now goes to the Grand Mufti. What chances that he's going to uphold the death sentence?
Of course, the expected is just to approve the sentence to death, because Grand Mufti always accepting what is coming from the government or from the courts. In other cases, he approved all of it. So it's expected, but we have a chance to drop this verdict and to have another appeal.
Okay.
It is the first stage, of course.
Okay. There is some hope, a small amount of hope. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us for our discussion today. It was really interesting to get all of your points of view. Abdel, Fattah here in the studio, Abdel Fattah, Fayed, Saad Jabbar and Mohamed Al-Masri. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.